All right, so today we get to see another plant family, and this happens to be a very, very, very plant as far as people are concerned. So in the past, we looked at the rose family that gave us or provides to us a lot of the fruits that we talked about, apples, peaches, epicas, and all of those. And then we looked at the poppy family, which kind of provides some medicine. And then we also looked at the mint family that provides a lot of the herbs and some of the spices. And so in today's family, we get to talk about the plants that provides a lot of the calories. And when we think about calories, it's going to be what's going to keep you alive. It's what's going to provide the food for the majority of the people and have sustained people for since the beginning of time. So when we look at the different civilizations, we can find that there are two main plant groups that they started with, and they domesticated, and that became the source of the food. One was a bean, a legume, and so we can find beans, a type of bean in every single culture. And the other one is going to be a grass, and that is going to be our plant family for today, the grass family. And here we have a nice savanna, the savanna in Africa, which is known to have some of the largest animals because they feed on grasses. And so the grasses are going to be a very important part of the ecosystem. They are going to feed a lot of animals, they are going to feed people, and they are going to be instrumental in making things go well and the planet run. So these are just some examples of some of the grasses that you might see out there. The bunny tail grass, usually growing as a weed somewhere in Southern California with some of its flowers. So we're going to go over all of that. So we're looking at the Poaceae, the grass family, all name Gramineae, monocot, found throughout the world, about 668 genera and 11,000 plus species. This happens to be a very, very large family. So we talked about the sunflowers, that happens to be bigger, and the orchid being the biggest of them all. So this is looking at for number 2 and number 3 as far as plant families goes. So native throughout the world, and especially able to survive the harshest climate. So here is the top of the Andes Mountains. And we can see that the largest plant that we are going to find are going to be some of the grasses. So the grasses are going to be instrumental in pioneering new areas to be conquered by plants. And they can tolerate a lot of the frost or a lot of the cold, and they're going to be very, very good in surviving that. And on top of the mountains, they're going to feed some of the wildlife that also evolve to survive the cold, in this case, the llamas. And they are going to be providing some food for those animals. So a niche, this is a niche on top of the mountains, but there are going to be tropical grasses and as well as temperate grasses and even grasses that survive in the salt or submerged habitat, so they can tolerate salt. So higher elevation, the grasses are going to be the dominant. In some of the savannas, during the time, the grasses are going to be their dominant. And in the US, we have the prairies that the grasses fed the bison, and those was that was a prominent plant. And so here is your typical example of a grass. We're going to find that what makes them so good at surviving and being able to be fed upon, because they have been eaten by animals for millions of years. And so this is Poa annua, the annual bluegrass, as our example for Poaceae. And so when we're looking at some of the grasses, we're going to find that some of them are going to have a rhizome or a stem that is going to creep out. That's going to allow them to spread and kind of move on and cover a large area. So some of them are going to have rhizomes or stolons. Rhizomes are going to be stems that are going to be below the ground, and stolons are going to be stems that are going to creep on top of the ground. So there's going to be two types of grasses primarily, either a clumping grass, as you saw with the Poa annua, or a running or creeping grass, as you can see here. For horticulture, the creeping grasses are going to be used for turf because they're able to repair themselves and they can survive the abuse a lot better. So rhizomes or stolons are going to be two of the main methods. And then we have the flower clusters, for the grasses. And then when we look at the grasses, here is what's going to happen. We are going to find that the apex meristem, the most important part of the plant, is going to be right above the soil line, and that is going to be the crown of the grass. So it's right above the soil line so that an animal can very well eat anything above if they do not harm the meristem that is right at the crown, then the grass is going to regrow. And so this is what also allows some of the grasses to be used as turf because they can be mowed a couple of inches from the ground and they're safe. They're just being eaten or being cut by a lawnmower. So that ability to have the meristem that can regenerate the plant right up below, right above soil level is going to be very, very important. So here we have the tillers. The tillers are going to be the different stems that will come out from the stem or from the crown. So that is just grass vocabulary. And so here we have a purple grass that you can see the different types of tillers or the different types of stems. And all of this came from the bottom of this. Then we have the grass leaf. And for the grass leaf, they're monocots, which means that they're going to be narrow. And they're going to be made up of two important parts. The part number one is going to be the blade. The blade is going to usually be green, and that's going to carry out the photosynthesis, the important part of the plant. And then there's going to be a sheath. The sheath is going to be important. It's going to kind of clasp around the stem. And it's just going to be an extension, kind of like a petiole, but it's going to be clasping the stem for protection. And so when we look at a leaf, we can remove it. We can see right here the blade and then the sheath. And then there's going to be another very important part of the plant. It's going to be the ligule. The ligule is just an extension of the blade that is going to be important as people begin to ID plants. Looking at the ligule is going to become very important to differentiate different types of grasses. And so when we look at our example here, which is a purple sugar cane being a grass, we can see where there's the sheath, the blade, and the ligule that is going to be right here, and it's going to be repeating as the plant goes up. And so we can see that wherever there is a node, there is that leaf, and there's going to be a lateral bud. So here's where we have the sugar cane. This is the area where the leaf was attached to. And so when you remove it, then you have just the stem without any leaves, and that's going to be the sugar cane. We have some of the tropical grasses that are going to have broader leaf. This is known as palm grass. So think about them as well, because there's going to be big palm-looking grasses as well as they're out there. And then when we look at the flower cluster, there's going to be grouping. So there's going to be florets that are going to be simple. And the flower clusters will have a protective bract-like structure. In grasses, it is going to be referred to as a glume. And so this is going to be the bract that will protect the ovaries and the developing florets. And so when we take one of those and we break it apart, we see a cluster of blossoms, the florets. Here will be number one, number two, number three, and there's the glume or the protective covering. When the grass is mature or the seed is mature, then we can see that the gloom is already dried out and is no longer playing a part. And then we can see the seeds with their covering waiting to be dispersed and hopefully land somewhere. And there are those are the individual seeds that are going to be dispersed. When we look at the grass family, they're going to have their own individual fruit. It is known as a caryopsis or a grain or a kernel. And so using the word grains for members of the grass family is a proper name. And so each of the florets will then become one of the kernels or one of the individual grains. That is going to become the important part of human food. And so here are several seeds from a bird mix. So not only do humans eat some of these grains, the birds eat them as well. So here is a typical bird feed or mix with many of the different types of seeds, including some of the grasses. And so here is a sorghum that grew. And so here is looking from above, and here is the flowers. And so the flowers, once again, there's going to be different florets, the cluster. We're going to find the male portions, the anthers, as well as the stigma. It's going to be right there. So the stigma's here and the anthers are there. They're going to be quite different. So the stigma is going to be a feather-like structure. So you see several of them here. And then the stamens will come out and those will actually produce the pollen. And so here we have the anthers and the stigma, so the male and the female component coming out of different areas of the plant. So most of them are going to be bisexual, but the time when some of the pollen may be released will be different. So this floret is now sending out the pollen, and this one is barely bringing out its stigma right here. So stigmas and stamens right here. And here's a different view showing you the gloom with the awn or the little needle, and then the stigma, and then the anthers and the filament right there. The pollination of grasses is going to be done by wind. So wind is considered a primitive method, but the grasses are kind of advanced, and so they revert it. They like the wind pollination, so that is why there is no really nice color on most of them, because they don't need to attract anything. Grasses will be shedding a lot of pollen, and it's hoping for the wind to take the pollen from some of the anthers and drop it on the stigmas of a different individual of the same species. And so the fact that grasses kind of provides us with most of the calories, or a lot of the calories, the majority of the calories, and is pollinated by wind, puts in question how important are those bees when people say that they're dying and we're going to starve. It's like, not really. We may not have the luxury of eating a lot of the fruits, the apples, the pears, the peaches, and the apricots. But as far as starvation, we are not going to starve because we can still eat the grasses that get pollinated by the wind. And so when we look at grasses, they are going to grow in a grassland. And if we look at just a few numbers, the world is made up of 20% of the grasslands here in Africa, where you can see an ostrich kind of standing right in the middle of that. And we have some of the wildebeest, again, very large herds that are sustained primarily through with the grasses or by the grasses. So the herd, the migration, some of the biggest migrations in the world are because the herds are moving to where there's fresh grasses that are grown. And even the elephant is 100% vegetarian as far as we know. They're going to rely on the grasses. So some of the biggest, not some of the biggest, the biggest land mammal It's going to rely on vegetation or grasses as well. Around here, we have farms, and so a very important part of farming is growing the hay or the fodder for the animals. So not only can we first harvest the grain for us, for people, then we can feed the remaining portion of the plant to the animal. The animal will then produce fertilizers that will be used back in the soil for enriching and making the area better. Animals are going to eat it, chickens, cats, anything. Dogs will eat grasses. Humans have used grasses for many, many, many years. So here are just some examples of early homes or early establishments where the grasses played a very important role in providing a roof for some of the house. Went from very simple to a little bit more advanced as they discovered how to work with mud. Grasses was stored, so there will be some areas where they would store it for the animals. And so when it's not available, they will be able to feed them. They want to keep it away from other animals, maybe some of the elephants, so they can put them on top of some of the acacias or some of those spiny trees. And even in England, if you look at this house, the real traditional homes were roofed with grasses. And as we have now developed and come up with a better roofing material, then some of these earlier versions have been abandoned. But even for people, grasses still provide some of the roofing. Now, when we talk about grasses, we're just going to include some of the bamboos because it is kind of a grouping of the grass or very, very closely related. Bamboos, the majority will come from Asia, and here's some of the giant timber bamboos that you may find. And most important are going to be the great new growth. Those new shoots that will come out of the rhizome from the ground. If you have the strength and you have the patience, you can harvest them. They are edible and they are sold in the store. So this is one that has provided food, a good source of food for people in primarily in Asia, but also anywhere else where some of the bamboos grow naturally or were taken and then eventually cultivated for food or for eating. So they can be pickled, they can be dried or packaged, they can be canned. There are many, many, many forms that you can find. Not only can you eat them, but they have also provided some of the utensils. So some of the spoons here, as well as baskets for fishing, baskets for storing material, and even for furniture, and even for homes. So in this case, the bamboo is very, very important. So here is a bamboo house, a lot more modern because it does have some of the metal screws, but it's pure bamboo. Here's when it was being built, including some of those the footings. There's the footings, and here's where they get attached. Some of the side, or will be the side for the roof. So here's a roof, and here's some of the rooms as they are being finished. So this is an eco-friendly building. So there's some of the walls that are made with mud. And here's some of the walls with some nice decorations of some recycled bottles and some natural light. And the outside rails are also made of bamboo. And even those rails are made of bamboo. So very important for food and for shelter. Now, when we look at, also from Asia, Saccharum officinarum, which is our sugar cane. This became really important. Prior to the discovery of sugar or sugar cane, or what was known during the time as sweet salt, there was very little sweet things that people could eat. There were crab apples and a few other fruits, but some of the sweetness that you are tasting right now were not in the earlier fruits when some of this were, people were moving around. And so when somebody discovered how to get sugar, it became a very important thing because humans love sugars. Our brain loves sugar. So that's why we love sweets and a bunch of other stuff. So sweet salt became very important. And so to grow more sugar because it is a tropical grass. When America was discovered, then the colonizing of the Caribbean islands took place, or leading all the way to South America. So you will find sugar growing in all those areas, and that is to supply the sugar that the Europeans love. So we have some of the sugar being grown, and here's where it has sent out that very tall flower spike. So there is the flower spike for sugar canes that you normally don't see. Here's the sugar canes as they are sold in the stores, and there are some varieties. So here's a purple sugar cane, and or ready to kind of be munched on. Now, the process for making sugar entails a couple of steps. So you can squeeze the juice out of the sugar cane. So there are machines, as you can see here, that you feed some of those sugar canes. And as they go through, they squeezes the liquid, or the liquid gets sold in some of the stores. So you can get it fresh, or you can get it in a bottle. So you can take the liquid or the sugar juice, and then kind of let some of the extra sugar kind of go away, and then you might have something like this. So this is almost like a sugarcane syrup. It's a lot healthier to eat than regular sugar, and it's just a sweet. So it's kind of like a syrup, but this would be a raw form of the sugarcane, and it's going to be or the sugarcane juice, and it's going to be kind of the beginning of the sugar as we know it. So then we can crystallize it, and I will welcome you to research how the sugar crystals are made, because it entails certain chemical processes. So then you get what is known as raw molasses that can later be turned into the brown sugar, which is piloncillo, as it is sold in some of the markets in Central and South America. It goes by different names, but this is just pure raw sugar that can later on be placed in a box and sold under dark sugar. Or when we have the pure white sugar, is because they bleach it to remove some of the brownness to it, and that because people like white sugar. So that is another chemical that is added to sugar to remove some of the coloring and make the white sugar. So here's a Ochoa sugar. So somebody had a company and put my name on it, and that feeds everything that we eat. So we have some of the Oreos, the biscuits, and the cookies that are going to be important and that everybody loves, including cupcakes, and cakes. And so here is Belize. So I mentioned some of the Caribbean islands as well as the Caribbean. So Central and South America, they have sugar plantation, and here's some of the lorries that are being driven to the plant. And here they're making a line to the plant where they're going to be squeezed to make the sugar. So that's going to be a very important plant. And during the time when sugar was discovered, it changed the world. So a lot of things changed because of sugar, including our diet, and including the destruction of many countries because of sugar. Then we have Symbopogon, which is the lemongrass from Asia. So here is a different plant. Rarely do you see it flowering, but I was able to photograph it with the flower clusters right here. And we can see that it is the sheets of the grass that have the flavoring. So the blades will be over here, they get chucked. And so the sheets, the stem is what gets made into the soups or used in the cooking for giving the citrusy taste to it. Here's some of the sheets and or some of the plants that are just waiting. And turf, I mentioned turf before. very important. Here's Stonehenge, and in areas where there's lots of water, grasses are going to thrive. So yes, the turf is going to be important. Around here, for ornamental purposes, we have some of the fountain grasses that you can see here, Pennisetum. We also have Malenbergia. This is a California native plant, so California deer grass. As well as here it is growing at the LAC campus, so in mass numbers, so clumping. And then from South America, we have pampas grass. Oh, horrible in that it has blades, or the leaf are very sharp. And anybody that has ever worked with them, with this grass, it's gonna get cut no matter what. It's a great plant. I had a student who was looking to buy and plans to acquire some of this cottony flower stocks for using mass wedding arrangements. And we happened to help her find them, and because they were being sold for $10 or $15 during the time. So we were able to help her out. And then we have Arundo, which is the giant reed grass. This kind of looks like sugarcane or bamboo, but it's a true grass. And so this comes from the Mediterranean, and there's rumors, there's stories. It has become an invasive plant in many waterways, including California. And they say that it got to California when they were exporting some of the statues and or some of the artifacts from the Greek. They would use the arundo as a lining to make sure that they would not break. And so when they would open the boxes, they would then discard the arundo rhizomes, and it took hold, and from there, it just started to spread. It is a problematic individual because it's also growing as a weed in the LA River or Los Angeles River. And so here it is where it just created a nice dense vegetation. So the arundo grass, it's a ornamental, but it has also escaped, and it's also now considered an invasive weed. And here's a more photographs of that. We have some of the Mexican feather ponytail grass here. And we have also Miscanthus, which is from Asia. This happens to be the Miscanthus junctia, which we like to refer to as elephant grass because it grows as high as an elephant. And here's when I've grown it before, and it's very nice, but it's very, very large. And then we have some of the smaller ones, like the blue fescue, as well as Sateria palmifolia, which is the palm grass that I mentioned. So this is going to be the tropical individual. That is going to have a leaf that is going to be much, much more broader. Here showing us the cluster of flowers with the reproductive structures. And then we have the stickleys. The stickleys is a California native marsh grass. So this grows in areas where on a daily basis, it could get submerged by seawater, which has salt. So the plant has a mechanism for extracting the salts from its body and or dealing with the high salinity, which will normally kill most plants, except for the ones that are able to tolerate or survive and are native to marsh areas. So that's one. And or we have Job steers. This is a very, very old cultivation plant. Here is one that's kind of dying, needs to be cut back. But here are the seeds, and the seeds are known to have been used for making some of the earliest rosaries because they can be shined and they can be quite shiny, almost look like jewels. And or they're also edible. So you might see some powder mixed with beans or mixed with oatmeals as a health alternative for somebody to eat. So it's edible. Now, when we look at some other important plant, this is Triticum, and this is going to be wheat. And if we want a grass that is responsible for feeding a very large number of people, it's wheat. Probably the most consumed grass in the world. If you go to some of the health food stores, you might see this where they are seedling wheat that are going to be chopped with a scissor, and then they're going to extract the chlorophyll. So they're sold as a booster, health booster for some of the smoothies, some of the juices, some of the food stores. Nothing more than baby grasses or baby wheat grasses. Here is wheat. As you can see, this is the flower cluster, including some of the awns and then the gloom. And then here is some of the wheat kernel or the individual seeds. So there's going to be different types of wheat out there. Again, wheat has gluten, but that is a selection of the more modern wheat, at least the higher content of gluten. As you look at some of the older versions that are still out there, their gluten content is going to be less. That gets ground up into flour. So flour is nothing more than ground up wheat. When you take away the embryo, when you take away the seed coat, then all you got is a bunch of starch, and that is going to be the basis for flour. So flour has fed people for many, many years. So you can take flour and then mix it with a little bit of water, mix it with a couple of spices, and then you have dough. And so this is where, if I had a wish, I wish for a magic mirror that would show me a window into the past so that I can see who was the first person that ground up the wheat, who was the first person that mixed it with water, and who was the first person, or how did they discover that if they were to cook this, it becomes into something palatable and something good. So I don't know. We know that people are very, very efficient, and wherever they went, they found things to eat, and they found how to process different types of grains to make them palatable and edible. So you have some kind of dough that you're then going to process it, and then you're going to cook it in some kind of stove. So let's watch a video. So the dough first gets prepared. So watch a video preparing the dough. All right, the dough is prepared. Then the bread gets placed to cook. In this case, this is naan bread, which is very simple, but very good. And they cook it on the side of the oven. So let's see if actually, there you go. And so as it's cooking, then we go to this one. And it's ready. So the question is, was somebody walking with some dough and dropped it on a rock and then they started cooking? I don't know. So what we do know is that there is going to be some flour that was going to be made into a bread. And so when you look at some of the earliest bread, such as the Middle Eastern, it's nothing more than just a very flat uh, flour and sugar, and it's very simple. So later on, they got more complicated, but some of the more traditional earlier breads were very simplistic to make, such as this that you can still get around here, and it's going to be important for some of the Middle Eastern food that you might see out there. So very early bread. Now make it more complex, and you have something like this. So now it is the French inventions who took the wheat and made it into what we have now as some of the bakery. So whoever was the first person to find a yeast that allow pocket of airs in the bread to make it nice and fluffy and light was a genius, because that is what happens here. We have a nice softer bread. So that's going to be now the basis for everything that we eat, or most people eat. Some of the bread that you're going to find in the aisles, the Wonder Bread and everything else, and as well as your French toast. And now you can add a little bit of egg. So bread, wheat, different forms of wheat are going to be very, very important. And that is what's going to be feeding, providing the calories for people to be alive. There's going to be pancake mix. Of course, we like our pancakes in the morning. There's going to be flour tortillas. Disgusting, but okay. And there's going to be pasta. So the basis for the Italian cuisine, we owe it to the wheat. So we have some pasta. We're going to boil it. Sorry, not boil it. Maybe put it in some boiling water for a couple of minutes. And then we can add a little bit of sauce with some cheese and maybe some meatballs. So the basis for the Italian cooking, all center around pasta, which comes from wheat. We have the biscuits, we have the cookies, we have everything that you have ever dreamed of. And then we have some of the cereals. You pick your favorite. We have another very important source of food for children and adults as they grew. They were relying on the grasses even back then. And then we have another very important grass, and that's going to be Avena sativa, which is going to be oats. So this is going to be some of the oats plants here, and there's some of the kernels that are ready to be ground up and made into flakes. Now, if you get some of the steel cut oats, those are just going to be the grains that are definitely just going to be cut, easier to cook. And then if they get ground up and made into flakes, then you get some of the more easier to cook, faster cooking oatmeal, such as the Quaker oats, or different types of brands, depending on where you go. And everybody loves oatmeal. I love oatmeal. Porridge, just simple, sugar, salt, no matter how you eat it, it's always going to be good. So porridge in the morning, oatmeal in the morning, great as a breakfast item. And then here we have wild oats. So keep in mind that before probably the cultivated individual became into production, people were already eating a wild oat, or an oats that would be a lot more prolific and would grow out there. As the new, more modern oat that have bigger kernels, probably more things to it for people to eat, became more popular. Some of these wild forms became out of popularity or drop out of popularity, and now they're just growing alongside with the others as weeds. But there's nothing more than the sister of some of the cultivated plants. So wild oats, it's a weed around here in Southern California. And then we have a hordeum, which I have yet to grow this, so I'm pirating some of these photographs. Hordeum, which is going to be our barley. And barley is also going to be a very old cultivated plant, not as popular as far as eating by people as oats and or wheat, but definitely for animals, farm animals, and people can eat them as well. It is a very good grain for you to eat. Barley for feeding children. So even when you were a baby, you were already being fed a lot of these grains. And more important, and probably the biggest market is going to be for fermenting and making the sugar that will eventually lead to the alcohol of beer. So if you love beer, which is disgusting, then you owe it to barley because that's going to be one of the ingredients for making beer. And it's also used for shampoos. So here's some fancy shampoos with barley extract. And then another one that I have yet to grow is going to be secale cereale, which is going to be the ryegrass. And ryegrass was probably cultivated way before wheat. It is believed that wheat first came into the picture or next to people as a weed growing on rye fields. Eventually, somebody found it, discovered it, figured out that it was better tasting, and so that became now the more important grain. But rye grain is still eaten by many cultures. So you can make rye bread, which is good. But more important, rye is a host for a fungus. It's known as ergot. The fungus name is Claviceps purpurea. And so ergot is a fungus that is very, very toxic. And it is believed that people were eating contaminated grains for years. They were kind of doped, they were kind of sickly, they were not healthy because they were literally eating poison every single time they would eat some of their ryegrass. And so it is believed to have kept Europe in the Dark Ages for a little bit longer than it should have because people were just not healthy because of this. They didn't know. It kind of looked like rye. So you can see some of the contamination right here. And so people were not aware of the existence of this. And so it would be never really a problem. So ergot is very toxic. That is where they found LSD. So the product of some of those drugs, lysergic acid. So it was, it did its thing. Now we understand it, and it's grown commercially for medicine, but then people did not know at the time. So that's going to be ergot and ryegrass. Now, and a better story here is Oryza sativa, which is going to be rice. And rice is a water grass. So here it is, a very beautiful field growing in Peru, obviously not native to Peru, but heavily grown there. It's native to Western Asia, where somebody found it and then it became propagated. So there is water underneath it. It has to be grown in a pool-like scenario. And so here's beautiful, beautiful rice plants just waiting to flower. Here's where they are planting some of the seedlings. So they put them in the water, or they flood some of the waters. California is one of the biggest growers of rice in the world. And so that's in Asia. And so here's the grass plants with some of the flowers or some of the seeds as they are going to begin to grow. So there's some of the stamens and some of the reproductive flowers for rice. Rice is good. If you have white rice, that can be eaten by itself or accompanied with uh, any meal. So you have wheat and rye and oats in Europe, and you have rice in what we know as Asia. And then you can take some of the white rice and add a little bit of seasoning to just make it a little bit better. And or you can add some saffron and or a little more seasoning like fennel, and then maybe some beans, and then you have some of this rice. And there's no denying that there is something really good tasting about rice and beans, and that has now kind of become a a staple for most people throughout the world. So any kind of rice and beans. And so then you can add a little bit of meat, a little bit of salad, or something else to the rice to kind of decorate it. We have other types of rice. So if you ever go to a Vietnamese dessert area, there's going to be some purple color rice. There may be some orange color rice that is colored with the gag fruit, that big giant cucumber, melon looking thing, or some beans, and or even some green rice. So different flavoring and different colors. So you have the beginning of the grain. So here's some of the white rice that can also be made into a pasta or a noodle, not a pasta noodle. And so the Chinese were already eating noodles way before the Italians. So it was the technique from the Chinese that was then adopted by the Italians and the Europeans with wheat that later became the spaghetti. But the noodles, rice pasta, ground up rice made into a flour and then reshaped into a noodle was already being done by the Chinese and the Asian culture for hundreds of years before the Europeans. So you have some of the rice noodles that are ready for eating, or preparing them with some sauteed shrimp and maybe some beans and vegetables, and or you can make them into a flour-like tortilla and or rice tortilla and make the dumplings, or you can make a flour and make some of the steam buns that are made with rice. So all those very, very important. So different types of rices or rice. So here's some of the jasmine, some of the basmantis, some of the brown rice, and even some of the black or red rice. So there's going to be a lot of choices. Most people tend to like the white rice because it is not as greedy and it's kind of nicer for the palate. However, it's just starch. There's not a lot of vitamins and minerals in just plain simple white rice. Here's some of the rice that will be made into some drink or some kind of drink. And here's some fermented sweet rice for eating. Baby food made out of rice. Baby food made out of oatmeal. We were eating it before, way before. Fermented rice. And we have also sake. So the Japanese wine or alcoholic beverage made out of fermented rice. That is very important when you are going to be eating sushi. So from Asia, then we can jump to Africa, where they have sorghum as one of their main grains. So it's an African plant. So here's the beginning. Here are the kernels. And so unfortunately, sorghum is not that good. And so when eventually some of the better grains like wheat and rice and corn were introduced into Africa, then they became more popular. Sorghum now being grown primarily for animals, but you can eat it. So there are going to be some great benefits. Again, it's lesser use, probably less understood, then people should appreciate it more. So here's some of the sorghum as a whole. Here's some of the seeds that are often sold as in the seed packets around here, that you can make them into scrubbing or brooms. So again, people have used them as well for other purposes, not just for eating. And then also millet. So that will be a different grass related to sorghum that is also underappreciated and should be consumed a lot more by people. And then there's going to be alpiste or Phalaris canariensis. That tends to be regarded as a bird seed, and it is the source or the main seeds in a lot of the canary seed mix. However, if you go into some of the health food store, you might see the ground up alpiste that you can mix it with your cereals and or make a drink out of it, and it's very good for your health as with every other grain that's out there. Again, lesser known, usually considered a bird seed or a bird kernel. And then we have Zea maydis, which is going to be the corn. And now we can jump into America. So the corn was the grass that provided the calories for the American people as they migrated. And so here is some of the corn as we grow it today. But the very earliest corn did not look anything like this. So corn has gone through a very big cycle of changes brought about by hybridizing and mutations and hybridization, sometimes perhaps deliberate, sometimes perhaps a mistake. And this is where I wish I could have my window into the past so that I can see the precise time when somebody stumbled or came up with something like this. And so what we know is that corn is a hybrid. Here is one of its parents. It kind of looks like a grassy individual because it's a grass. And so was this some of the earliest grains that some of the American people started eating? And then as they till and prep the land or move it around, it brought it into close proximity with another similar species. And so perhaps and so what we have here are the parents of our modern day corn. So the old name is Teosinte, which is Sea mexicana. So it is believed that our modern day corn came from as a hybrid from these two individuals, a clumping, grassy looking plant. So was it human accident? Was it deliberate? We don't know. So the parents of the corn, here is where we have the flowers. So we have the tassels that that are going to be the male flowers. And then we have the cob. In this case with Teosinte, it's going to be very small. And just like any other grass that is out there, once the kernels are mature, they're going to shatter and scatter naturally to be germinated rot. And so that would be the case with Teosinte, not with the modern day corn. So here is the reproductive structure of older corn. And if we then move into many, many years into the future, then we have something like this, which is an old-fashioned corn. We can see that it looks very different from what you might consider as the modern day corn. For one, we have all of this corn husk that are very small, and then we have the hairs. The hairs are important. They are going to be the stigmas of the flower. What we can see here is that every single kernel has its own covering of the husks. That is not something that you see in modern day corn. And you also see the cob that is very, very thin. And it is even breaking. So at this stage in time, the cob is going to shatter. It's going to release the individual kernels, each of them protected by its own husk. And they're going to move around. Eventually, the husk may rot, and then the seed will get planted, or the husk is going to protect the seeds as it is being maybe moved around by animals. So individual kernels covered with their own husk is a characteristic of some of the older corn. And so here it is, a different view with an entire corn cob with the individual kernels covered. And this where the individual kernel was removed, and here is with just one floret. So the kernel's here, and there is the stigma that eventually leads to the kernel itself, and that is where the stigma enters the seed or the ovary. And so this is now a big move. So now the cob has gotten a lot bigger. The kernels have gotten a lot bigger than some of its parents. But then if we, once again, move several hundreds of years or thousands of years into the future, then we can have something like this, which is a Peruvian old-fashioned corn. And we can see a couple of things. We can see now bigger kernels, but there's a portion where the flowers have not been developed here. So this will never grow into a corn kernel. So they're kind of probably remnants of the other or ancestor. And you can see also individual, uh, probably in not viable ovaries that may be in there covered with their own husk. But now the kernels themselves are no longer covered. So that is going to be the modern day. And here's a different view. So an individual florets here that are probably sterile. And there's some of the corn. Now the cob is completely covering everything. And here's an even close-up where you can see where the stigma uh, is attached to the kernel. So this is, again, somewhere a couple of thousand years ago, this was probably a big step. And so then we have the move into our modern day corn. And here to show you some of the modern day corn, here's where we have the kernels that got pollinated. So yes, the stigma is very important. The silks are very important. A pollen has to land at the tip of every single silk in order for you to get the perfect cob. But when we look at some of this modern day corn, this being young, we can see that some of the kernels in the early ages of stages still have the remnants of those husks. So now the husks have been reduced into just kind of papery like scale that usually when you eat corn on the cob, they get stuck in between your teeth. So that is what happened. So I guess as the kernels got bigger, then the husk kind of got smaller. And so that eventually led to the modern day corn that is kind of now does not have any covering. And here is all the kernels that were fertilized, and there's some of the silks. And so now the corn as we know it today is going to be much, much bigger. It's going to be a lot more productive. And this is a gigantic change from some of the ancestors. And so having a lot of kernels means that there's going to be a lot more calories and people will be able to sustain for longer periods. So modern day corn. And so also the change from being clumpy or clumping individual took place. So now our modern day corn is a single stalk that will have the tassels on top, the male flowers, and you'll have the corn cob with the silks, which are the female flowers somewhere in the middle. Here's when you get it from the store. So the remnants leftover stigmas would be right here. So those are no longer functional. So that's why they kind of wither away. And now we have the entire cob completely covered by some kind of leaf-like corn husk structure. And here's some kind of mutation that happened to photograph where we have some of the tassels reverting into being female, and they have an ovary and they are producing a kernel. And it happens. So we have male flowers that have reverted to being some kind of female and having a kernel. We do have some uses for the silks. So they are sold as medicinal or for medicinal purposes. So don't throw them away. And then if we look into Central and South America, we have a very large selection of corn. So here is just a couple of the colors from Peru. And here's some different photographs, but just showing you the beauty and the diversity of some of the corn that we still have in certain parts of the world. And that's going to be my goal, to go into every part of the world and just look at all their beautiful corn that is grown by some of those cultures, and they have kept them alive. So you can just take the corn, roast it. That's good. A little bit of sugar, salt, and a little bit of lemon. That's all you need. or you can boil them. This is the best way to eat them. Plain, simple, nothing added to it. So just the greatness of the corn, just enjoy. Or if you're the type of people that likes to contaminate it with butter and cheese and mayo and a bunch of other disgusting stuff, that's good for you. It's a good way of ruining a very, very good corn by adding all that. Depending on where you are in the world, here is uh, choconostle. No, mixing up the word. Thomas is going to kill me. Choclo, sorry, choclo, which is the Peruvian name for corn, or at least corn on the cob. Here's where it's being sold in some of the markets. Here is where it's being cut and also sold. And they also boil it. They eat it with cheese. And you can enjoy it if you ever go to Peru. So choclo, sorry, Thomas, choclo nosle, choclo. So Peruvian corn on the cob, or esquite, as is referred to. So this is just plain either boiled or roasted corn that it gets served on in a cup, and then you can mess it up by adding butter, cheese, lemon, and or mayo and a bunch of other nasty stuff. So esquite, some people adore it. It's disgusting. And as you go into certain parts of the world, here is some of the Peruvian yellow corn that gets made into corn nuts, or actually this is popcorn in Peru, which would be the equivalent of corn nuts in the US. And I don't think people eat enough of this, and it should be eaten a lot more. Uh, so as a side dish here, be served with banana, or here in the traditional uh, Peruvian ceviche, here is choclo, or their corn, boiled corn there. And then we have the discovery of popcorn. Like, who was the first person? How did somebody take this corn and all of a sudden it popped and created what we know as the modern day popcorn? So it is some of the water that's inside the seed that boils and eventually pops, and it makes the popcorn that we get to eat today. But I wish I knew who was the creator of popcorn, who was the first person to have done that. There's different types of corn that can be sold out there. There's going to be canned corn that some people really adore. If you take corn and you grind it up, then you get grits. And then you have grits. That is also a very important staple for many people, that you can then mix it with some butter and some salt, and you have your grits as your side dish. Or if you take grits and you toast them and you make flakes out of them, then you have the beginning of cornflakes. And cornflakes was developed by Mr. Kellogg, where Cal Poly Pomona is located, as a food for people in asylum. So people that were not mentally well, where they could eat something where they would not hurt themselves. And so cornflakes became one of those foods that eventually became a very popular cereal. Uh, and so then you take corn, and corn by itself, it's very difficult to digest. So most often you would have to cook it, you will have to prep it unless it's young, or when it's already old and dry, and you can harvest it, store it, plant it, or you can process it. And so you have the plain corn, and then you have gypsum or lime. And so this is another time that I wish I had a mirror into the past where I can see who is the first person that took corn, which is very important source of food, and mix it with this white powder and put it to boil. I don't know, and I wish I would know that, but it is a known fact that in Mexico, and this is mainly in Mexico, the liming process using gypsum became very, very, very important. And so you take the corn, you add some lime, or in this case, gypsum, and you boil it. And then you get what is known as nixtamal. And so nixtamal is just the boiled corn that then becomes a lot easier to eat. Then nixtamal gets taken and gets ground up. And then as a result, you have what is known as masa. So the beauty with the liming process that was not really known, or it was probably known but not really understood by the early people, is that adding lime or boiling the corn in lime changes the chemical and the consistency of the masa, making it a lot more sticky. So you take the corn, you add the lime, you get this tamal, you get the hamani. Hamani then becomes a masa or flour. And so the flour, the masa, becomes very, very sticky. And so this begins the process of making tortillas. And so similar to bread, the dough needs to be knit. And so then we have traditionally made tortillas by just slapping your hands. And so that would be the job of many people to make all of those tortillas. So the tortilla is then placed to cook. And so, as mentioned before, the liming process changes the chemistry or the chemical consistency of the masa, making it very sticky, and that allows for the Mexican tortillas to be very, very thin. And you only find that in Mexican tortillas. So then eventually the tortilla gets cooked, and then it gets some of the air inside gets expanded, making them swell and fluff, and then you know that they're ready when this happens. And then you can put some cheese with some salsa. That's really good for fresh made tortillas. And then you can make yourself some tacos or whatever you want to do with them. So, or you can fry them and make yourself some fried tacos. So in countries where the liming process is not carried out, such as El Salvador, they have pupusas, which are going to be thicker. So yes, you can still get away with making a tortilla-like food, but because they do not use the lime and it's not as sticky, you have to make it thicker in order for it to retain its shape. So here's Kevin's favorite pupusas. Or if you go into Colombia, they have arepas, which are their version of tortilla, but arepas, once again, are going to be very thicker, because they do not have the liming process that is necessary for making the very thin tortillas. So arepas, if you never had a chance, they're very good. And then we have some of the earliest tamales. So keeping in mind that the husk that we use in modern days was probably a later invention, some of the very earliest tamales, they would use the leaf itself, the corn leaf that they would use to wrap the masa, probably stuffed with something, turkey, or some other animal, or maybe some beans, or maybe some salsa, maybe some peppers, and that's about it. And then you wrap it with the corn leaf, the green portion, not the husk. And those became what is known as tamales de ceniza, that are still enjoyed and cooked by by many people. So that is just a way of wrapping masa and cooking it. Later on, we have the modern day husk or a more modern husk that serves now as the main vessel for cooking tamales. So you wrap them, you boil them, you steam them, and they're ready for you to enjoy with a little bit of chocolate. So tamales made out of masa, which is a great thing. Or here's some more tamales and or frozen tamales for anybody. We have the tortillas, and there's going to be many brand of tortillas that can also be fried and made into tostadas. That can also be made into crisp, corn crisp, totopos or chips, and or even the oil that needs for that to happen is extracted out of the corn. So 101 uses for corn, and corn is now being grown in many parts of the world, just like rice, just like wheat, just like oats, and it's still out there, and it's become a very important food source for people. And then we have molasses and or corn syrup, and there's problems with corn syrup that is being added to everything. So read the labels, and if it's any kind of sweetener, probably it's corn syrup. And there's also corn smut with la coche. Corn smut, just like we saw with ergot, is an infection of the ovary or the seed. And so there's a fungi that will contaminate the kernel, and it's going to grow into this grotesque like tumor-like structure. So those people found a way of enjoying them, so they taste like mushroom. When they're young and they're kind of whitish inside, you can eat them. They get harvested, they get sold. They are using some fancy fufu cuisine, nothing more than corn smut or a fungi that is an infection of the plant. And so here we have a grass that is keen in surviving. So don't be amazed if you see empty lots and there are going to be hundreds of grasses growing, because they have survived a lot and they're still going to be with us. And as you're venturing into the grasses, be very careful, because there might be some lions hiding amongst the grasses. And I do not want to see how many people have been killed by lions as they were exploring some of the savannas moving out of into Europe and Asia. But we know that grasses provide a great cover for some of these predators. And so with that, I will end it, and hopefully you get to appreciate grasses for the great value that they provide to people. So take care.